I got to know my grandfather more and more over the years. He and I had a very late dinner at his little house in the country one night, and afterwards we went on his back porch and he smoked his pipe and we just talked. And I happened to ask him if he had any regrets in life, and I expected him to talk about having never remarried or never opening his own clinic. He'd been a doctor all his life. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment and then said that to that very day he held one very shameful secret inside, and he finally felt safe enough to reveal it. He used that word specifically, safe. He said he regretted never telling the police that he was almost certain of the identity of a killer. So, needless to say, I begged him to tell me the story, and with a lot of hesitation he did. It was the year 1951, and my grandfather, whose name is John, was working at a rehabilitation center in Cumberland, Maryland. John woke up in bed one night in January, and he felt his heart pounding, and he had a bizarre feeling of being very cold inside his skin, not on its surface, inside it. He was alarmed. He got up and he started pacing back and forth across his bedroom, trying to understand this feeling. It was like a panic attack, but with more unusual symptoms. Before it fully subsided, he happened to look out his window at his front yard and the little road beyond it. There was someone standing out there at the curb. It was a little before 2 in the morning, and it had begun to snow very lightly. John put on his robe and his shoes, and he opened his front door. The woman out there, it was a woman, she didn't move. She was holding one arm up at her side in a strange way. And John called out, but she didn't answer. And he moved closer to her, and as he did so, he heard a small sound, and he realized that the woman was wearing little finger bells on her left hand, and she was clanging them softly as she stood there in the snow. She wore tattered shoes and a ragged brown dress. She looked very young, in her 20s, and had a plain face and unstylish hair. John asked her if he could help her, but she only looked at him and clanged her little bells. She wasn't shivering at all, which was odd. She seemed to want to be where she was, but he told her to follow him inside so he could call someone to come get her. And she followed him willingly enough, as she spoke very soft words under her breath, not mumbling, but whispering. My grandfather remembered that his bizarre symptoms had disappeared quickly as soon as he ventured out into the night. He asked this woman some questions, but she didn't answer any of them except one. When he asked her if she needed something to eat, she said, "I swallowed a farmer's eye in Lancaster." And then she opened her mouth wide, as if to show him. Her mouth was empty, and she closed it again and smiled, a strange smile. She clanged her finger bells and followed John to the guest room. His plan, if he couldn't get any information out of her, was to just keep her safe and dry and call a friend at County Hospital to drive over in an ambulance as soon as dawn came. He didn't own a car himself, and he never has since. She sat on the bed, and she told him that she would try to go to sleep, but that sometimes, quote, they shook her head about. There was no indication of who they were. John asked her once more if there was someone he could call. To this, she responded that she was not even close to being who he thought she was. She said, "You make me laugh." And then she threw her head back and did just that. And that laugh was what first made my grandfather scared to be in the house with her. The voice that came out of her throat was first her own, but then suddenly it seemed to belong to a small child, and then after that a different woman entirely. He compared it to an audio montage made by a sound editor. He stared at her, waiting for her to say something more, but she closed her eyes and lay down on the bed and sounded her bells again. He went back upstairs, but he couldn't go to sleep after that. After his strange physical malady and having this stranger on the floor below him, it wasn't going to happen. He sat in a chair and he smoked and he watched the snowfall outside, and he was wondering what would happen if it accumulated so much that the ambulance couldn't come. 2 hours passed, and his eyes were getting heavier and heavier when he heard the shaking of those finger bells again. Far away, but it didn't sound like they were coming from the guest room. They seemed closer. The sound came just once. John got up and he opened the bedroom door very slowly, and he went out into the hall. He thought the sound had come from as close as the staircase. But the woman wasn't there. He stood in that same spot for a full half hour, waiting. He went down the stairs as soon as the sky began to lighten. He called the hospital from the kitchen, and the ambulance was promised in about 30 minutes. It would have been 10, but the snow was really falling now. The wind was picking up, so John waited nervously out on the back porch, closing the door behind him. He didn't even want to check on the woman. When the ambulance arrived, he proceeded very carefully up the drive. John went out, and he told the driver, whose name was Patrick Edliston, that they didn't need a gurney. The woman could walk under her own power, and she just needed an evaluation. So the two men went into the house, and John knocked on the guest room door. And when there was no answer, he opened it. The woman was gone. They both checked the whole house, though there was nowhere for her to have gone. Edliston trotted back to the ambulance to call back in. John went through the kitchen and stepped out onto the back lawn, which was under 4 inches of snow now. He immediately saw footprints leading across the yard toward the woods. He began to follow the footprints, moving as fast as he could, though the wind and the snow in his face and the slippery footing made it difficult. Once or twice as he went, he had to just stop to lower his head and peer closer at the ground, because the darkness wasn't retreating very quickly. He spotted the stranger a few hundred yards into the woods. She was near the bank of a small stream. As soon as John saw her moving away from him, he shouted, and she stopped and turned. And she waited for him to approach. She smiled and took a step towards him. John remembered that the wind had blown her hair into her mouth, and it had caught there, so it appeared almost as if she were eating it. He had to lean in to hear what she was saying to him. All it was a single sentence. "I'll make you remember me, and all I can do," is what she said. And she suddenly raised her left arm and swung it toward him in a swooping arc. He felt her hand connect with his right cheek hard, and then, unfathomably, he swore, as an old man, that he had felt her fingers puncture his cheek entirely, tearing right through the flesh, and he could feel her fingertips touch his teeth, and those cold little bells digging against his face and the open wound. For 1 second of mortal shock and panic, he stood there as she laughed and pushed her fingers deeper through his cheek, seeming to feel for his tongue. He flinched back instinctively, and her hand withdrew, and he felt his cheek become whole again in an instant. There was no blood, there was no anything. It had never really happened. The woman turned, and she began to run through the snow, and this time John didn't follow her. He sank to his knees in a panic, feeling his face. There was nothing wrong with it. The woman disappeared into the mist, and a minute later Edliston was behind him, helping him to his feet. There was a real police search for the woman then, but it didn't amount to much, because 16 inches of snow fell that day, and the area was stifled. She'd vanished. That began the time when my grandfather would see her in his dreams. These were the worst nightmares he'd ever had, but eventually they did begin to fade. And one morning, almost a year after his encounter with the woman, he woke up inexplicably cold, and he almost went into a state of panic before he realized that he wasn't cold because of some premonition that she had returned, but because he'd left a window open. He couldn't forget that feeling of having been freezing inside his skin, as if his organs had suddenly been coated in ice. More than once his dreams took the form of reliving his first hour with that woman. But in the dream, when she said she'd eaten the eye of a farmer in Lancaster and opened her mouth to show him, he woke up stifling a scream, because now she truly had. There were other waking moments when my grandfather was haunted. Once he was on a train to Manhattan to visit his brother, and the train had to stop in New Jersey with an engine problem a little after dark. It was sitting on the tracks in the middle of a small town, and he looked out the window, and he saw a woman sitting on a bench under a street light, about 100 yards away. He couldn't make out her face, but for some reason he was immediately convinced that it was her. She never moved until the train pulled away again 10 minutes later. 7 years after the night of that snowstorm in Cumberland, John was contacted by the Ohio State Police about a murder case that was being investigated in Youngstown. By that time he was considered an expert in abnormal psychology, and he was occasionally called upon to testify in court as such. And now a detective who knew of his work wanted to send him a stack of paperwork that amounted to the evidence collected so far in the killing of Father Soren Narnia, a 40-year-old Catholic priest. Half the evidence consisted of photographs of the crime scene. Now, because the material was too sensitive to send through the mail, the detective asked John if he could drive out and meet him at a hotel, which was near the western Maryland border, where John was at a convention of clinicians. He agreed, and the detective gave him the materials, and over coffee he told him more about the case. So John went back to his hotel room, and in the small hours of the night, the first thing he did was read Father Corvitt's diary, which hadn't been kept routinely, but did contain a few references to a homeless woman who'd arrived in Youngstown about 7 weeks before the murder. Father Corvitt described her only as a docile, mostly mute woman who he'd been trying to help. For some reason he never referred to her by name. In the diary he only called her the Snake Lady. The police never had found out why. Nor did the priest ever make direct mention of the time he began to spend in university libraries and theological and seminary libraries all around the area and well beyond it. These habits had to be verified through looking at his materials checkout records, which confirmed that he had begun to research something that was taking him further and further away from Youngstown, in his necessity to find books that were more and more obscure. Whatever it was he was trying to learn about first touched upon schizophrenia and drug abuse, but then toward the end he seemed to be reading mainly about ancient religious beliefs centered around the Middle East. It was impossible to really tell what he was focused on, though he had requested at one point a photocopy of 2 essays on the obscure belief among some Babylonian tribes that the souls of the dead could congregate inside a single body to resurrect it. There just wasn't that much to go on in the diary. So John read that, and then he started going through the stack of crime scene photos. The scene was the church where Father Corvett conducted his services. In the wide shot of the interior, which was taken from the back of the church, it seemed totally empty, unless you looked hard, and you could see that all the way in the first row of pews, a solitary man was sitting, facing forward. The other photos showed that this was the priest. This was Father Corvett. He'd been killed with 2 knife wounds to the heart. He was just slightly slumped over, as if he'd been sitting on the pew, turned partially sideways, perhaps speaking to someone who'd been sitting beside him. He'd simply never fallen over. My grandfather said there were more than 150 photographs of him in this position. As he looked more closely at the little details of each one, he saw writing on the seat of the pew, about 24 inches away, small writing that had been done in pencil, almost looking like a child had been bored. The police knew about the writing, and they just didn't know where it had come from. But the style of those letters, which spelled out completely nonsensical, unconnected words, made my grandfather set the photos aside and light his pipe to calm himself. He called the detective, Harold Brown, to see if maybe he hadn't yet left the area, and he hadn't. So my grandfather left the hotel in order to walk the 12 blocks to the police station where Brown was meeting with a colleague. He needed to talk to him in person because he recognized the letters the killer had printed on that pew from some faint writing that his night visitor had made on the windowsill of his guest room. She'd taken a pen off a table and done it, making just 3 or 4 words out of nothing, and putting odd-looking accents over the H's and the V's. So it was about 12 blocks across downtown Grantsville to the station. The streets were very quiet. John was walking across the little town square when everything around him started to lose its color all at once. The color was bleeding out of every tree and every street sign and car parked against the curb, and he began to feel sick to his stomach. He started to cough, and then he lapsed into a dry, heavy retch, and he made his way to the closest bench, and he sat down, and he put his head between his knees. A profound sense of dread came over him. He sensed that something truly awful was about to happen to him, and he had just raised his head to look up and around to see if maybe there was someone else on the street or a public place he could run to feel safe, when suddenly his head was flung back, then forward again, as if an unseen and unfelt hand had grabbed it. Forward and back, until his neck was almost snapping, his head whipping up and down. He tried to shout, but he couldn't. He had lost all control of his body, which was almost flying off the park bench with the force of this bizarre seizure. It lasted only about 5 seconds, and then he fell off the bench and onto the grass, dizzy and in great pain. After a minute, he stood up, trying to regain his balance. And he told me that somehow he knew that as long as he didn't take another single step toward the police station, he would be all right. He turned and began to stagger back in the other direction, back where he came from. And with every step he took, more color came back into the world around him, and the pain in his neck subsided. And he was back in the lobby of his hotel in just a couple of minutes. He told the clerk that if anyone called to be put through to his room, he should tell them he had taken ill. He made his way up to his room, collapsed on his bed, and he remembered weeping, knowing that he could never tell anyone about the woman, ever. He would send back the crime scene evidence without a note. by intending to speak of that woman and perhaps sending the police after her, he felt he had enraged something that was in control of her. He vowed at that moment never to speak of her to anyone for any reason, in the hope that he would be left alone. That night was the longest of his life. He waited to feel that invisible hand return to maybe choke him, strike him, kill him. He went to church for the first time in his life 2 weeks later, and he fully embraced Catholicism that summer. He never stopped. That's where his story of the woman essentially ended. Decades passed and nothing strange ever happened to him again. He wanted to tie his peace with the events to his acceptance of spirituality, but he wasn't sure about it. He thought maybe it was more about his refusal to act on his suspicions. He felt something sensed that he wasn't a threat. And as he grew older, his memories of this terrible thing began to fade, blessedly, just like any other memories. He told me life was so long that the human mind could learn to endure and bury almost anything. There were Holocaust survivors out there, people who had lost their children in accidents, and when life became simply of a certain duration, these things just slowly faded. No matter how much they shook our beliefs, time inevitably did its work. And even though you can never be quite the same from what you'd experienced, those decades labored to make you whole again. He dedicated himself to his work and his children, and he simply never told anyone about what had happened. Until that night when he was 71, and he told me about it there on his back porch. Finally, I asked him if now he felt unburdened, or just maybe worried that telling the story held some power. He shook his head. He said, "No, I don't think so." And just maybe there was an explanation of the events that lay deep within his subconscious. The story was told to me in the year 1993. In 2012, my grandfather was 90 years old. We'd remained close since then, though I'd since graduated from college and gone on to have my own career as a doctor. I still visited him every year at Christmas. He still lived on his own, but now down in southern Maryland, in Solomons. This past winter I arrived there to stay for a couple of days, and we exchanged presents and had dinner, like always. He was very healthy and of sound mind. I took him out to a nice restaurant in town the night after Christmas, and I had to start driving back to Boston afterward. We got in the car at the restaurant, and I drove to his house. I remember that he had forgotten to lock his front door, which wasn't a big deal. He sometimes just didn't bother. Where he lived was very safe. We went into the house, and he told me to go down into the basement to take a box of toys that was there, back to my niece and nephew. So I went down the stairs into the unfinished basement. There was virtually nothing down there but a big table and a chair and boxes of mementos. When I turned on the light, I saw that something had been written on the gray cement wall on the east side of the house. It looked like it had been written in white chalk. I stared at those words. At first I didn't understand what they meant, because the first few of them were just nonsensical scribbling, letters a foot high that didn't make any sense. But below that there was an actual sentence. The words said, "Can you hear the bells?" A question. I heard my grandfather's footstep on the stairs above me, and I called out for him to stop. But something about the tone of my voice, so frightened, made him come further. And so he and I both stood and looked at what was written on the wall. I could see where the white chalk had come from. It had been taken from a plastic tub of it. That was one of the presents my grandfather had bought for my niece and nephew. Without saying a word, I guided him back to the staircase and I led him upwards. I was holding his arm tight so he wouldn't fall. We got up to the top of the steps and we walked to the front door of the house. We hadn't turned on the house lights yet, except for the one in the kitchen, and I could feel the darkness pressing in on us. I didn't look to my left or to my right for fear of what I might see. I ushered Grandpa to the car, and I opened the door for him and he got in. I slammed the door shut fast, and I trotted around to the driver's side and got in, and I tried to make it so that Grandpa wouldn't notice me quickly glance into the back seat in case something was there. Only when the doors were locked and the engine started did I feel safe. It was my intent to start driving us toward Boston, and we would never come back. Ever. I wouldn't let him. 3 turns through my grandpa's neighborhood was a street called Peach Run. Quiet, dark houses on either side. And my headlights picked out a figure up ahead, a human figure. It was a small woman moving away from us. When the headlights splashed across her back and flowed past her, and she was caught in that circle of light, she stopped. When she did, I did too, applying the brakes. I looked for a second at my grandpa in the dark. His eyes were wide, staring through the windshield. The woman turned towards us, and then she began to walk toward the car. The woman was old, so old. Her hair was long and dirty. She wore a plain dress that was almost more like a sack. When she walked, it was creakily, with a noticeable limp. My eyes went to her left hand, and there they were. There were the bells. Except they'd become so old and rusted over the decades that they seemed to be a permanent part of her flesh, which was blackened all around them. There must have been a deep infection at one point, untreated for years, and now her hand and the bells were one mutated object. It had been 63 years since my grandfather had heard them in the middle of the night as he sat in his room, frightened of this same woman who had never forgotten him. But at least she was mortal. She had aged, and eventually she would have to die. Whatever controlled her, whatever horrible things she had done over a stretch of time so long I can barely conceive of it. Where had she traveled? Who had she killed? How many people had she killed without anyone ever locking her away somewhere for good? She staggered forward 3 more steps until we could really see every detail of her withered body. I took my foot off the brake and I hit the gas pedal then. And we swerved around her and we sped up, and I took a sudden right turn, which led us to the main road. When we got there, I drove us over the speed limit to the highway, and we were on it in 3 minutes. I kept saying, "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay," and Grandpa said nothing. He died just a month ago of viral pneumonia, 8 months after leaving his house that night. Neither of us ever returned to it. He moved in with me and my wife and my kids, who were only too happy to have him. We told them there had been terrible flooding in his house. I let a real estate agent handle everything about the sale. And how many nights have I spent wondering how long it will really take for that woman to die, so that there's no chance I'll be walking alone one night and feel her presence, and turn and see that she somehow found her way to Boston, wanting to demonstrate to me that she is not who I think she is. I'm not as mentally strong as my grandfather. I know my mind would break if she were to reach out to me in the dark with a hand that had fused with bells that would never sound again.